Good afternoon, everyone. So before we get started with this afternoon's session on representations and imaginaries, Jeremy Prestold would like to come up and just say a few words about the journal Monsoon, right? To call attention to, make sure people are aware of the importance of that in this conference and in this country-focused season. So without further ado, please, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's wonderful to see everyone here. It's been a fantastic event. It's been wonderful to meet those of you I hadn't met in the past, and it's wonderful to see so many old friends as well. I just want to very briefly say a word about Monsoon, because although Salah introduced the journal, one of the things that we very much hope will come out of this event, as we've organized with other events, is a special issue of Monsoon. I don't know if everyone's seen Monsoon, or had a chance to look at it closely, I should say, but this is the second issue. And so, to kind of preface what I'd like to put in a sort of plug for Monsoon. But I want to preface that by just saying that it's a biannual issue. It's, of course, in print and online. And my co-editor, Rogayo Busharaf, who also co-convened this series with Uday Chandra, we conceived of this journal as something a bit different than what's been done to date. We approached the journal, and the Africa Institute has fully supported us in every aspect of our approach to this journal. But the approach has been to offer a broad tent, to have an explicitly multidisciplinary approach, but also to do as much as possible as we can with this journal. So we'd like to have a special issue coming out of this conference that would have a series of research pieces, but perhaps some of you have seen, we also do conversations with artists, we have visual essays. Moving forward, we'll be publishing fiction, hopefully poetry as well. And one of the things that I think is particularly relevant for this conference, that I want to say while we're all in the room, is that the Africa Institute has generously supported us from the beginning. Of course, this is the home of the journal here at the Africa Institute. And one of the ways in which they've generously supported us is through the aesthetics of the journal and the reproduction of images. So I'd just like to sort of plant a seed here that we are always looking for wonderful images for the journal. We hope that all of your pieces can be accompanied by visual material. We have the resources, thankfully, to support that. And as you may have noticed, it's also in color. We'll actually have some copies of the journal to hand out as we're leaving. So you'll go home with a copy. But I just want to emphasize that the journal is trying to sort of push the boundaries of what's been done in Indian Ocean Studies. We want to have a format for a broad range of work and visual representations of various aspects of Indian Ocean Studies. So this is even more important for the issue that we hope comes out of this wonderful conference. The last thing I'd like to say is that for those of you who haven't presented here today, I want to put in another plug for future issues of Monsoon. We are very excited to receive both standard research pieces, but also any ideas that you have for future special issues. We're collaborating with Rita and Laura for the special issue that'll come out of this. conference, but we're also collaborating with many others on future issues. And so if you have ideas that you'd like to explore through Monsoon, please don't hesitate to contact me and Rogaya. We're very much open to any and all ideas. So I don't really want to take up any more time, but I also want to thank Laura and Preeta for all of their work and echo what others have said, that we greatly appreciate all of the incredible efforts that the faculty and staff of the Africa Institute have offered, and all the support they've given, and all the support that Salah has given us as well. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Jeremy. This fourth panel on representations and imaginaries features four distinguished panelists in addition to our discussant. We have Gaurav from the University of Michigan, Pamila from the University of the Free State in South Africa, Natasha from York University, and Nalima from Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar. And then Meg will offer framing connective commentary as a discussant afterwards. So without further ado, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I do have to also thank the Africa Institute, Preeta, Laura, Salah, Jeremy, and the wonderful staff who have been so important to bringing us here and the logistics support that you've offered. So thank you. It's been a wonderful couple of days, and I'm looking forward to more. I'm going to only present half of the paper that I have written, so maybe our discussant might have things to say about the paper that you may not have heard, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I hope my time has not yet started. Okay, so commenting on the novels of his friend Sandeep, Rashid, one of the characters and part narrator of Abdul Razak Gurna's novel Desertion, writes, quote, "I've read most of his books, but I no longer look forward to them. I think that despite their zest and fluency, they have grown increasingly certain of their judgments, and to be too certain of anything is the beginning of bigotry." Much like Gurna himself, Rashid writes these words in England, having arrived there as a student from Zanzibar in pursuit of a PhD. The times back home are turbulent ones, and what was originally intended as an academic sojourn abroad has become more of a condition of exile. Confronted with the realities of the Zanzibar Revolution, Rashid writes, quote, "I began to think of myself as expelled, an exile. I realized I had been thinking of myself as someone in the middle part of a journey, between coming and going, fulfilling an undertaking before returning home. But I began to fear that my journey was over, that I would live all my life in England, a stranger in the middle of nowhere." As he lives his life in England and reflects on the political traumas that his friends and family suffer at home, he feels a strange disconnect between the liberal sentiments of his university peers and the actual political realities in revolutionary Zanzibar. This is a fairly long quote, but I think it's the most important quote in this book. "Soon I began to say black people and white people, like everyone else, uttering the lie with increasing ease, conceding the sameness of our difference, deferring to a deadening vision of a racialized world. For by agreeing to be black and white, we also agree to limit the complexity of possibility. We agree to mendacities that for centuries served and will continue to serve crude hungers for power and pathological self-affirmations. No matter, I uttered my lies and thought them a greater truth, and found a kind of self-affirmation in raucous songs of grievance and rebellion, of which I partook in spirit more than in voice. I had my eyes opened to the even bigger lies that had us all tangled and bound beyond relief. In the midst of the uproar about wars and civil rights and apartheid, with a sense of being present while the pressing issues of our world were being argued over and fought for, I was drawn away from the complicated cruelties that were happening at home. They could not be inserted into this conversation with its pared down polarities and uncluttered certainties, and I was only able to suffer them in silence and guilt when I was on my own. Rashid's unease with the increasingly racialized vision of the world and the political and moral certainties that accompany it result from his own sense of the long multiracial history of Zanzibar and the violent disruption of this history in the 1964 revolution, soon after independence from the British in 1963. Despite the horrors associated with it, with a great number of Arabs and Asians murdered, raped, or killed, or exiled, the anti-colonial rhetoric of the time, with its focus on righting the wrongs of past injustices, political and economic, could not fully account for these, quote, complicated cruelties. To concede to this narrative of post-colonial liberation was to also concede to what Rashid refers to as the sameness of our difference, which is to say, to an ordering of the world as divided starkly between black and white, limiting the complexity of the possibility of other identities, Arab, Indian, Swahili, and their historical interplay. Desertion is an imaginative exercise in reading the history of racial and cultural contact in late 19th century coastal East Africa and Zanzibar, and its afterlives in post-independence times. The novel begins with the dramatic arrival of a severely wounded stranger in a small town on the eastern coast of Africa. The man is discovered by Hassan Ali, a shopkeeper by trade and a devout Muslim who is on his way to clean the mosque and call the early morning prayer at dawn. On finding the wounded man, Hassan Ali takes him home, where the stranger is nursed back to health by Rehana, Hassan Ali's sister, with the assistance of Malika, his wife. As the story unfolds, we learn that the stranger is an Englishman named Martin Pierce, and that he has found himself in his current state after being robbed and abandoned by his Somali guides in the interior. Pierce is himself an amateur historian, and prior to his arrival in East Africa, has worked in Egypt in the education service, and has joined and then later abandoned what had turned out to be a particularly violent hunting expedition into Uganda. Pierce's arrival on the eastern coast takes place in 1899, 9 years after the area has become a British protectorate. As he settles into the house of Frederick Turner, the British officer in the area, Pierce decides to visit and then thank the family that has nursed him. A love affair ensues between Rehana and Pierce, the details of which are uncertain, and which prompt Rashid at one point to interrupt the narrative and note, "I don't know how it would have happened. The unlikeliness of it defeats me. Yet I know that it did happen, that Martin and Rehana became lovers. Imagination fails me, and that fills me with sorrow." Rashid proceeds to imagine a number of potential scenarios for this love affair. Perhaps Martin had come to pay the family a visit to thank them, had dined with them, and then Hassan Ali had asked him to return, which he did, on account of his wanting to see Rehana again and not seeming rude. Perhaps he had written her a letter in Arabic, a language which he could speak, but which he had difficulty writing. And this letter had then piqued Rehana's curiosity. Perhaps instead, after a couple of visits by him, Rehana had taken the lead and sought him out to return to him the diary that he had inadvertently left behind when he first left, and which he had guarded so carefully. While the details of the affair between Pierce and Rehana are left to the imagination, we do learn more about Rehana and her family. Rehana and Hassan Ali are themselves children of an Indian man named Zakaria, who had, quote, who always said that he was a Muslim living among Muslims, and that was enough for him. Zakaria, who spoke Kiswahili, Arabic, and Gujarati fluently, had fully assimilated into the local culture and had fallen in love with a Swahili woman, Zubeida, who he had ultimately married. Zakaria had been welcomed into the community, and even though he was an Indian, he was fully accepted as a son-in-law by Zubeida's parents. He had never seemed much concerned about his Indianness, and he chose not to travel much to Mombasa to visit relatives, since he wanted to avoid the Indian notables who were disdainful of his marriage and would call his children chotara, a derogatory term reserved for children of Indian men married to African women. Zakaria and Zubeida led a happily married life until he passed away. His son Hassan Ali had taken over the shop upon his father's death, and over time married Malika, a Swahili woman who was the daughter of a family friend. Before the arrival of Pierce, Rehana had been married to a newly arrived Indian trader named Azad, who had been befriended by her brother Hassan Ali and who had gradually became a friend of the family. Rehana had fallen in love with Azad, as he with her, and they had married and lived happily for many months before the coming of the monsoon winds. Then, when the time came for the ships to return to India, Azad went to Mombasa to join his crew, left and never returned. Quote, he had abandoned them, abandoned her, and gone back to his Indian life, laughing at her love and her hunger, chuckling at their gullibility. At first, the family thought that some mishap had taken place, but when no such mishap was confirmed, and the ship kept returning without him, the desertion had to be sadly acknowledged. Azad's desertion of Rihanna is only one of the many that punctuate this novel of interracial and intercultural love, its possibilities and its failures. The others, Pierce's ultimate desertion of Rihanna, and 2 generations later, Jamila's desertion by her rich urban husband, Amin's forced separation from and thus desertion of Jamila in deference to the wishes of his parents, and finally Grace's divorce from Rashid, all signal the increasingly difficult and painful demands made upon intimate relationships by social norms and strictures. Tracing these various relationships, Gurna's novel seems to indicate that race, culture, and social status have come to matter more rather than less as history has progressed over time. Despite the disdain of the Indian community, Zakaria and Zubaydah have had a relatively happy married life in the 19th century. So do Hassan Ali, the mixed-race child of an Indian and Swahili, and Malika. The failed marriage between Rihanna and Azad is by no means attributed to a racial or cultural cause. And while ultimately Pierce leaves Rihanna and returns to England, the narrative nevertheless shows them defying local traditions and having an affair that is known to the public but never officially acknowledged. When the scandal threatens to hit home, Pierce moves to Mombasa and Rihanna follows him. There they live together and conceive a child defiantly named Asma, the one without sin. Narrating their story as told to her by her grandmother, Malika, Jamila says about Pierce, he left once, and then he returned, and then he left again. It's something that he returned, that he was torn about leaving her. It makes you think he must have loved her, even though he still left. But Rihanna, we learn, goes even further. When Pierce leaves, one of his friends, a Scottish man named Andrew Mills, moves in and lives with Rihanna for 14 years until he dies, leaving her money in his will. Rihanna may have lost respectability in the eyes of the community for having been one European's woman after another's, and she may have turned to drink to cope with the societal pressures. But she still visits her relatives, and the narrative tells us that, quote, she opened up a shop and employed a tailor, making and selling curtains and bed covers and other such items. Had she by this point become a courtesan, a mere sexual companion, or did Mills and Rihanna indeed love one another? Gurna leaves this question intentionally open, asking his readers to imagine the possibilities and to withhold the certainty of their judgments. 2 generations later, when we're introduced to the stories of Rashid, Amin, and Farida, we see that the social strictures in matters of love are even more constraining. When Amin falls in love with Jamila, who happens to be the daughter of Asma, his parents admonish him and immediately order him to stop the affair. Do you know who she is? Do you know her people? Do you know what kind of people they are? Her grandmother was a chotara, a child of sin by an Indian man, a bastard. When she grew up into a woman, she was the mistress of an Englishman for many years. And before that, another Muzungu gave her a child of sin too, her own bastard. That was her life, living dirty with European men. They are not our kind of people. They are shameless. They don't think of anyone but themselves. Here, then, the possibilities of a loving relationship are curtailed in the interests of social propriety. Much as it hurts him, Amin decides to cut off his ties to Jamila out of loyalty to his parents and never marries. For much of the narrative, Amin's brother Rashid, from whose point of view some portions of the narrative are presented, remains in England guilty over his own departure. His original decision to go to England in pursuit of higher education is cast as a conspiracy between his British teachers and him. They helped him apply to British universities, coached him to sit the scholarship examinations, imposed on him a regime familiar to them from their own faraway school days. It was as if they had entered into a conspiracy with him to send him to England. Rashid's sense of his own desertion of his homeland is underscored at one point when he receives a book of poems written by his sister Farida. It is dedicated to her father and mother, to Abbas, her husband, and to, quote, Amin who is good and Rashid who never left us. Calling this last note a kind but sentimental lie on the part of his sister, Rashid also feels guilty about the love that has been denied to Amin and that he has been able to find for many years with the English woman, Grace. That too is a relationship that ultimately fails. Desertion, then, is a novel concerned with the nature of interracial love and its conditions of possibility in the larger frame of colonial contact. Can love exist between a colonizer and the colonized? Or is the colonizer necessarily a conqueror and therefore, by definition, not a lover? What is the nature of commitment to a loved one? What are the obligations of love? Do we, and if so, how do we judge the one who deserts a loved one? And while Gurna raises these questions on the order of relations between his various characters, perhaps the most uncomfortable moments are moments when he poses them about the colonial relationship itself. After a reading of the colonial map of Africa as it stood in the 1950s, the narrator remarks on the remarkable clarity of a world that was color-coded red, pink, purple, green, according to the colonial authorities that occupied it, and the confusion that resulted with the mad scramble out of Africa, quote. No one really understood what a panic was in the offing, that in a few years, most of these European administrators were going to break camp and dash off home, leaving behind a series of paper-thin treaties and agreements that they felt no obligation to honor. This too, then, is a betrayal, a desertion on the part of the colonizers, a relationship entered into that is abruptly abandoned. Now, lest there be any confusion about this, it should be clear that Gurna's text is not an apology or nostalgia for colonialism. Indeed, in its characterization of the excesses of the plantation manager Burton's imperialist rhetoric, and in its explicitly critical account of the violence of colonial ideology and practice throughout the world, Desertion is clearly critical of the European dream of empire. But it is also critical of the quick withdrawal, a complete abrogation of responsibility, the pretense that once independence had been granted, one could easily walk away, leaving the mess behind for the newly freed subjects to clean up. The question of colonial responsibility to its subjects is one that looms large over Gurna's work. But I want to, for the moment, to comment on a passage which appears in Rashid's first interruption to the hitherto omniscient narration of the romance of Pierce and Rehana. After dwelling on various possible scenarios for their developing affair, Rashid expresses surprise at Pierce's recklessness in his pursuit of Rehana. Quote, "This was 1899, not the age of Pocahontas, when a romantic fling with a savage princess could be described as an adventure. The imperial world observed some rigidity about sexual proprieties. The empire had become an extension of British civic respectability, and while that allowed for some high spirits and adventure, it no longer included dalliances with subject floozies, at least not from its officers, at least not officially." So while the narrator Rashid may find it hard to imagine such illicit, even taboo alliances, I suggest that Gurna is being ironic here, since no writer with as keen a historical sense as Gurna could possibly throw in a sentence or a paragraph about a romantic fling between a European man and a princess without alluding to one of the greatest court scandals of 19th century Zanzibar, the real-life romance between between Princess Saida Salme and the German merchant Rudolf Heinrich Reuter. It is to this story that I do not now turn. That I do turn in the longer version of the paper, and we can talk about it if you're interested. But what I do is a reading of Saida Salme's autobiography, and I do a reading of the various sense of betrayals that she faces. Betrayals from her brother Bargash, betrayals from the British, betrayals for the Germans, and there's a whole discussion of Salme, her intimate relationships, possibilities, failures. So it's a kind of like a parallel reading of the real life of Saida Salme against the backdrop of this fictional novel by Gurna. Anyway, thank you so much.
All right. Let me adjust. Okay. Okay, I fear I'm going to go over, so you're going to just have to cut me off at some point. I'd like to echo everyone else here as well to say thank you to Laura and Preeta for organizing this wonderful conference, and to the Africa Institute for hosting us. Much appreciated. It's been a wonderful couple of days, and I think it's been really wonderful to be in conversation with so many different people and meet people that I know only in name, and to actually talk. So I think that's an important aspect of these conferences that are in person. All right, part one, from a waddle to a dearth of dodos. The dodo bird. It conjures catchphrases such as dead as a dodo or dumb as a dodo. In this first part of the paper, I want to look more closely at the bird behind the legend, to gesture to Alan Griot's tome on all things dodo, published by a local Mauritian press, published in 2005 and reprinted thereafter. I bought a copy of his wonderful book during a visit to the Blue Penny Museum in Port Louis in May 2022, at a time when I myself was still in the tail end of recovery from my own COVID infection. Perhaps because it was still pandemic times, where untimely death surrounded us, the extinct dodo is what compelled me during that research trip and got me digging deeper for dodo bones, following in the footsteps of many before me, as I felt that this flightless bird was a specter haunting me during my Mauritius days. I saw iconic signs of the dodo everywhere, both text and image, that invoked its comical, gaudy ugliness, made me smile and feel sad both, and wonder at its demise, and made me want to connect its species extinction to wider and more recent discussions regarding the Anthropocene, multi-species thinking, and human-animal relationality, visual arts, and Indian Ocean islandless, a topic I've written about elsewhere. In other words, archipelagic islands were always good to think with, only now with regard to new ways of seeing old topics. Okay. Once I started researching the dodo bird, I also began to see that there was a long list of curious writers and artists, both past and present, engaged in what we call dodomania, precisely because its extinction is the first to be directly tied to human intervention, quote, by man's unrestrained interference with nature, according to Griot. It exposes the fault lines as well of colonialism, modernity, and global ecological devastation, a set of arguments taken up in the last section of this paper. David Quammen's 1996 book, The Song of the Dodo Bird, is one such example, and he introduces us to the dodo, and I'm not going to read it, so it's there for you guys. Quammen highlights these basic facts around the biogeography, the study of the facts and patterns of species distribution of the dodo itself, suggesting that we know very little, in fact, due to its early extinction, of the resulting role of rumor thereafter shaping its study. However, here I want to take up, or suggest that rumor itself should be taken more seriously, and it shedding light on the history of the demise of the dodo, particularly the rumors that abound regarding the bird's naming, both scientific and popular, which tell the story of early Portuguese and Dutch imperialism, as well as human first impressions and encounters with this strange bird on the island of Mauritius. Okay. This wasn't a very good image, apologies. Cygne swan, or Cygne capuchon, hooded swan, is one such name for the dodo and is attributed to the arrival of the first Portuguese sailors to Mauritius in 1507 when they first saw dodos and likened them to swans, which may have also inspired the island's first naming, even as they left no historical record suggesting as much. A second possible Portuguese name is derived from dodo, meaning foolish, stupid, or simpleton. A third early naming, and possibly attributed to the Portuguese as well, is derived from the onomatopoetic approximation of the bird's own call, which Quammen describes as two-note pigeony sound like doo-doo, dodo. Next are a range of Dutch linguistic influences appearing in the naming of the dodo. Wagglestocks, wallow birds, wagglegovel, meaning nauseous bird, a disgusting bird, as mentioned in the journals of Dutch Admiral J. Cornelius van Eck from his expedition to Mauritius in 1598, where he first recorded acts of dodophagy, the sampling of its meaty flesh, which no amount of cooking or boiling made edible. Its lack of color and tasteness is significant in that it played a role in the dodo's extinction. We'll go back. In the dodo's extinction, for as Griot slyly points out, quote, had the dodo been more palatable, it probably would have been domesticated and preserved to this day, end quote. In other words, if dodo meat had become an acquired taste by the Dutch, rather than a product of consumption for human survival on this island, then the history of the dodo would be similar perhaps to that of the domesticated pig. A next group of contumely Dutch namings evolved from the etymology of the name dodors and its variants, and comes from a combination of the Dutch words dot, tuft, if there are any Dutch speakers here, excuse my pronunciation, airs, ass, because the bird had a tuft of feathers on its bottom. In other words, it was named due to its large rump. Or to put it more bluntly, less politely, as Koyman does, round ass, fat ass, the swollen lump-ass bird, the sluggardly bird, the slow, lazy bird. The linguistic naming of the dodo first appears in print in 1634 in British traveler Sir Thomas Herbert's publication, Relation of Some Years' Travel into Africa and the Greater Asia. Finally, Rufus cucullatus is the Latin name given by scientists and recorded by Linnaeus in his classification, with that name being assigned the official scientific name of what we now call the dodo. Koyman sums up quite succinctly the journey of dodo naming, which says so much more about Indian Ocean island travels of the Portuguese and Dutch during the 16th and 17th centuries. He writes, quote, "The various conjectures all converge on a common notion, the foolish, swollen, sluggardly bird with the big butt. It may not be ornithologically accurate, may not be fair, but it's recognizable as the dodo of legend," end quote. Hence the caricature of the dodo that stems from its rumored history of naming with visual derivations taking off from its checkered linguistic patterning, which I turn to in the next section. Okay. Sorry, I cut out the introduction, so the numbering is off. So this next section, imaging the dodo bird, or what I call dodophagy, dodophilia, and dodomania. Okay. It's a much longer paper, so I'm sort of going to extrapolate different sections. In this section, I want to look at historic imagings of the famed dodo bird as a way to create an early archive, physical material, textual and visual, of sorts, suggesting once again the role of rumor and speculation in its representation as well as its storytelling. As Tom Van Doren suggests, quote, "While reports, sketches, and paintings of the dodo survive from the 17th century, it is difficult to determine which of them is accurate and based on first-hand experience. Like a game of telephone or Chinese whispers, it seems that many of these accounts and images were themselves based on other accounts and images, alongside varying degrees of poetic license," end quote. So by way of organization, I established 3 archival sections: extant dodo body parts and bones, 2 19th century British publications, and 3 historic paintings, drawings, and illustrations. Okay, so first is a set of dodo bones, tissue, and body parts that circulated in Europe. They're the result of the travels of captive dodos that were sent to 3 locations, or so we surmise: Holland, the UK, and India, as well as the discovery of a plethora of dodo bones in the second half of the 19th century at the Mauritius marshlands of Mauritius. There are varying reports of the number of live dodos that were taken aboard Dutch ships in the early 1600s, when dodos were first discovered and viewed as an exotic bird to be collected and gifted. According to Masuji Hashisuka, Japanese marquis and author of the 1953 publication entitled The Dodo and Kindred Birds, or the Extinct, sorry, I lost my space, or the Extinct Birds of the Mascarene Islands, there were 17 captive dodos that traveled the world, 1 sent to Italy, another to Denmark, 9 to Holland, 1 to Prague, 2 to England, 2 to India, and 1 to Japan. It is unknown how many of these 17 dodos survived the oceanic journey and or arrived safely at their respective destinations. However, there are reports of 3 sightings of live dodos in 3 countries, according to Griot: Holland, England, and India. The story of 2 dodos in Holland first includes a drawing by Adrian van de Ven in 1626, whose caption reads, "This is a faithful portrait of wild-hogan doders called by our sailors because of its prominent behind, which was transported alive from the island of Mauritius as it was seen in Amsterdam in the year 1626. A second is a dodo painting by Jacob Hofnagel. Sorry, I'm off on my, let's see if we can get to, okay. The second is a dodo painting by Jacob Hofnagel, you'll see these, that suggests that the dodo sent to Prague survived and had a short existence in the menagerie of Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II before he was duly stuffed and became the subject of this Dutch artwork. The story of the 2 dodos that were sent to the UK is as follows. One was sent by Emmanuel Altham, which had accompanied English diplomat Sir Thomas Herbert to Mauritius in 1628, and upon his return placed a live dodo aboard the William ship under the captaincy of a Mr. Peirce. The other live dodo that made its way to England was put on exhibition in London in 1638. What happened to it after its public display remains unclear. We also know very little of the story of the 2 dodos that were sent to India. Peter Mundy, an official of the British East India Company, recorded seeing 2 live dodos in the menagerie of Mughal Emperor Jahangir in Surat, where he'd been working for some years. Sorry, I'm not wondering what happened to my images. Okay, apologies. The extensive travels of these exotic birds suggest so much more about the curious world of bird-human relations during the 16th century. The travels of these last physical remains of these captive dodos is still largely unknown. However, bits and bobs of body parts did make their way to various collections and museums in Europe. They include a leg and a head at Oxford, a now lost foot that was once on museum display in London, a leg in Holland, a head in Denmark, and lastly a bit of skull in Prague, which came from the live dodo that had been put on display in the 17th century menagerie of Emperor Rudolf II. The rest of his body stuffed and the subject of Jacob Hofnagel's painting. These extant body parts and the fact that they continue to be part of collections and put on museum display suggest an enduring interest in the captivating dodo bird. And then there's a larger discussion of the discovery of the bones in the Moro Song, which is a 19th century development, and I'm not going to go into that detail. Okay. And then I'm going to skip to... Second is a round of 19th century, mostly British publications dedicated wholly to the history of the dodo. These books suggest an English appetite for all things dodo had started in the early 1800s and was directly tied to their recent colonization of Mauritius in 1810. Inheritors of the island following the Dutch and the French. These include an 1828 paper written by John Duncan, curator of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, who decided to review all the material related to the dodo, which was then published in the Zoological Journal. The Dodo and Its Kindred, this is this image, by Strickland and Melville, published in London in 1848, and Memoir of a Dodo by Richard Owen and William John Broderup in 1866. Of course, in the midst of all this was the London publication of Charles Darwin's seminal 1859 book on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin himself made no reference to the dodo, surprisingly, even as he did travel to Mauritius in 1836, close to the end of his 5-year journey around the world on board the MS Beagle. He did, however, comment on the nature of this flightless bird more generally that's pertinent here. He writes, "As the larger ground-feeding birds seldom take flight except to escape danger, I believe that the nearly wingless condition of several birds which now inhabit or have lately inhabited several oceanic islands, tenanted by no beast of prey, has been caused by disuse. Herein lies the power of his theory of natural selection, which was largely speculative at the time of his writing, but has provided a scientific explanation for why the dodo stopped flying at some point in its natural habitat of harmonious Mauritius, just his words, with its beautiful scenery, and became extinct once it's encountered an unknown set of predators, mostly humans, pigs, and monkeys." Third is an interrelated visual set of drawings and illustrations on the dodo that span the 17th to 19th centuries and lend itself to particular caricature, but also draws a viewer in with its strange pull, ongoing attraction as a sight and wonder. That makes for a collective sigh as if it had only survived. It is an eclectic mix and range of representations that include a range of inspirations, locations, and mediums. There's the extant 17th century, okay. Let's see, sorry, my images I don't know what happened. I think maybe I sent the wrong version. Apologies. There's an extant 17th century Indian oil painting. It's in here somewhere. By Ustad Mansur that features fine anatomical detailings and the gray coloring of a dodo bird. There it is. Front and center and surrounded by other birds from the menagerie of Mughal Emperor Jahangir, one based most likely on a sighting of the 2 dodos that traveled to India. It is a set of oil paintings by the talented Dutch animal painter Roland Savary de Corte, who was probably at the court of the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna when he encountered a live or stuffed dodo and is the biggest surviving collection yet of dodo artwork. One of the best known dodo paintings was owned by British writer and painter. I'll just go through these. There's Roland Savary. Okay. One of the best-known dodo paintings was owned by British writer and painter George Edwards, who presented to the British Museum of Natural History in London in 1759, where it was a source and reference point for many countless replications going forward. It remains there today, hanging and still unsigned. A last visually important drawing of the dodo bird included here is Lewis Carroll's, a pseudonym for Reverend Charles Dodgson's famous Alice's and Adventures in Wonderland, published in London by Macmillan and Company in 1865. Yeah, I definitely sent the wrong version. Apologies. With illustrations by Sir John Tenniel, who had been commissioned to do them by Dodgson. Here, the dodo is one of the many fictional characters that Alice meets in her wondrous adventures, which includes frequent visits to the Oxford Museum, and who appears as rather a stupid bird, ridiculed by the other animals. It is not mere coincidence that the dodo appears in Carroll's novels, for it is most likely that both Dodgson and Tenniel would have visited the Oxford Museum and seen the 1651 dodo painting by John Savary, a nephew to Roland Savary, who took up the favorite subject matter of his famed uncle, who was also his mentor. In the colorized version of Tenniel's illustration, the dodo looms large and with a walking stick by his side. There we go. And that's in the first version, and is addressing Alice front and center, surrounded by a group of birds. Once again, this wondrous dodo bird's representation over time is the culmination of layers of accumulated perspectives sitting atop one another, and with layers of text and image, words, paint, and ink attaching color and affect to its iconicity over time. Okay, and then this is sort of, I feel like I kind of had to go through all of that sort of information on the dodo to get to sort of what the arguments are that I'm trying to make. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay, okay. So this next section is really sort of the meat of the paper, and I wanted to give you a sort of visual sense of the dodo itself. Okay, and then and let's get to this, okay. Please read that text if you get the moment, have a moment. Sorry, I'm not going to read it. In this last section, I want to think about a new set of imaginings, following upon David Quayman's story of disquietude of the last dodo cited above, to suggest 3 directions for extinction studies that I'm labeling here: tragedy, elegy, and comedy. With tragedy, I want to expand on the idea of the dodo as the poster child for extinction, precisely because its demise was due to human intervention, and with a set of lessons to be learned for future conservation practices in an era of the Anthropocene. With elegy, I want to focus on multi-species thinking and what the loss of this strange bird over 300 years ago has done for human fears and anxieties concerning its own future extinction, its own untimely end, and the stories, both textual and visual, we collect and tell ourselves. Lastly, with comedy, I want to turn to the more contemporary role of the dodo as a container of meaning and memory and identity politics, as what I call feelingly missed, to use Quayman's description, for Mauritius, including the centrality of islands specifically for anthropogenic thinking. Okay, and just quickly, the tragic story of the dodo. Here I'm using the work of Tom Van Doren to think about sort of thinking about extinction as what he calls a sort of blunt, never a sharp singular event, but rather is more of a dull one, a slow unraveling of intimately entangled ways of life that began long before the death of the last individual and continues with the ripples forward. And then, in other words, I'll just summarize here. Stories of the dodo bird abound here in the here and now and very much matter, and as much as the stories we tell about them reflect back on our own fears and anxieties about the fragility of our own species, its future tenses so as to ensure we don't go the way of the dodo. Here I'm thinking of the children's animation film Ice Age, which continues where Alice in Wonderland left off by introducing the dodo bird to a new, younger 21st century generation, and shows the extinction process wherein the wattle's last female clumsily falls off a cliff, ensuring that species reproduction is no longer possible and reinforcing the stereotype of the dumb dodo. So here I go through these 3 aspects. Okay. And I talk about the dodo collector. Okay. Okay, so just to go quickly, 1 minute. Thirdly, with comedy, I want to turn away from the global context of species extinction to the dodo as feelingly missed on the island of Mauritius today, through local productions of meaning and metaphor and its place of origin. Interestingly, Griot notes that less than 100 years after the dodo's extinction in 1690 thereabouts, historical information on the bird had already been lost to its human population. So in other words, it took approximately another 100 years, including the findings of the dodo bones stuck in the swampy muds of Morisson and the beginning of a bone collection, before a lively 19th century interest in all things dodo was resurrected in the country of its birth and death, and soon became an iconic feature. Fast forward to my own visit to the island nation state in May 2022, and my own experience of the dodo as feelingly missed was palpable and palatable as well, funny enough. Everywhere I turned, I saw Dodo imagery on a range of tourist paraphernalia, including keychains, t-shirts, tea towels, and fridge magnets. I drank Dodo flying beer, which was quite tasty, in fact, and bought a stack of academic books dedicated wholly to the dodo bird, and fell in love with a small ceramic dodo bird that holds pride of place in my bathroom. In other words, the dodo in absentia had shyly and slyly become the official mascot of its homeland of Mauritius. When and how this happened is not exactly known. Rather, the argument I'm trying to make, and perhaps an experimental one at this point, is to think about a form of rewriting the historical past wherein the dodo perhaps stand in for the feelingly misindigeneity of a set of islanders where everyone is an immigrant. So in other words, thinking about the dodo as the indigenous past of the island where in fact there is none, and thinking about human-animal relationality. And that's sort of where the argument of the paper is going. Precisely in this absence of a human one, a new form of identity politics and collective memory making in an era of multi-species thinking. It is one that stakes a politicized and nationalistic claim to its dodo past as a signifier, perhaps, of the country's prehistory in the face of a future of forged human-animal relationality, survival, and fragile islandness. Okay, I'm going to end there. There. And then I end by thinking about the beautiful ugliness of the dodo bird. Thank you. Sorry, apologies for going over.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Africa Institute, to Salah, to Laura and Preetha for this opportunity to share my work with you all. I'll be speaking today about two mixed-race artists hailing from the Mauritian diaspora, from London and from Montreal, respectively. Without forcing a comparison, I discussed their work today for the generative threads that emerge one onto the other. I begin with a guiding question. How might aesthetic encounters with archival fragments give form to an Indian Ocean imaginary? At the Blue Penny Museum in Port-Louis, Mauritius' capital, visual artist Shiraz Bayjoo encounters rare portraits found from an estate, a white family's personal archives of their formerly enslaved domestic servants and indentured laborers. Needless to say, not a lot of information was recorded about the people in the photos, or at least none that the artist could find, and so the artist intervenes. Through collage and image transfer, the figures are severed from their original context. Quote, cutting into signifying chains of race and representation, that's Kobena Mercer. Collage is key to Bayjoo's practice, offering a fundamental sense of juxtaposition, disruption, and anti-narrativity. Collage's radical form also incites encounters. And here, Bayjoo's collage also sutures to one another in their comparable framings and aesthetic treatment. This suturing is significant since these black and brown figures would have been segregated from one another in Mauritius, ostensibly in their differentiating labor roles, but really for fear of collusion and revolt. However, more than a cut and paste aesthetic, collage animates a dismembered form of remembering. So these are just three from En Famille from this series. Within these wooden frames, Bayjoo's collaged figures recede behind and are enveloped by Empyrean pools of blue, green, and orange, suggesting an ambiguously textured interiority. The artist did not wish to gloss over these lives. Maybe that's why the resin is unevenly applied. Moreover, scratches, marks, and chips on the wooden support measure the passage of time, though how much exactly is unsure. Indeed, rather than simply represent the archive, Bayjoo's narrative restraint reflects Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, as her archival analytic holds space for that which cannot be verified. Bayjoo's gestural hand suggests an archive still information. Fabulation rejects master narratives to dwell in the indiscernible. And in this dwelling, something else emerges. This something else, I would like to suggest, finds material conduit in the aesthetic And Bayjoo does not simply reflect an idea, but models a reading practice that announces the possibility of another relationship to the archive. Hartman's critical fabulation stems from Black Atlantic studies. However, her ideas for me generate an oceanic seam between the Middle Passage and Kalapani, or the legacies of indenture. As indenture studies scholar Gayatri Bahadur points out, quote, there are large gaps in the archives, and these are structural in nature, end quote. She describes how unconventional modes of evidence, such as family photography and oral histories, mostly family lore, gossip, hearsay, lead to alternative forms of communication and thus knowing. Bahadur offers a speculative history across Kalapani. Written in the subjunctive, her grammar of what could have been intersects imaginative and investigative methods. Beyond recovery, the fabular has the capacity to take history's raw material and through language and ritual summon the ancestors. What is that if not conjure, she asks. There's a sense of conjure in Bayjoo's series En Famille, bringing into co-presence what was with what might have been. In search of more Indian Ocean archives and turning to bigger islands in the region like Madagascar for some possible linkages, other moments of conjure appear in Bayjoo's fabulatory repertoire as well. For example, at the Quai Branly Museum in Paris, Bayjoo encounters a street theater entertainer who gazes directly at the colonial camera in the midst of performing a trick. This magician figure appears and reappears in more than one of Bayjoo's exhibitions, and like a spectral presence, shifts form with every new context. Whereas the artist's archival selections and artistic interventions in En Famille animates fabulation as an archival method, here, with the magician, we see allegories of conjure emerge instead, and I'll come back to this point of allegory in my conclusion. There's something to be said about how Montreal-based trans femme poet and performer Pamila Mackerel, in their book of poems titled Zomme Femme from 2020, also embraces conjure. Poetics is in many ways a coveted form for the fabular, unburdened by the politics of representation, at its best, at least. Such aesthetic form has the capacity to address archival voids by exceeding conventions framing reality. Consider how Kal Torabali from Mauritius and David Dabadine, Guyana, chose to give texture to that which cannot be found nor contained in the archive through poetry. Needless to say, Torabali and Dabadine overlook how the study of indenture is a queer endeavor, and for more on that, see Susan Persad, Amar Wahab, Jordash Elapan, Rajiv Mohabir, and others, who do not merely exhume otherwise censored queer content as alterity or anomaly, but who treat queerness as a constituting way of understanding indenture unthought. Lamaka's book, Zomme Femme, emphasizes the queerness of indenture studies alongside the queerness of the fabular as a disruptive propagation that reflects the materiality of queerness despite access to transparency. Composed of 8 long-form poems written mostly in the first person, Zomme Femme is intended in part as an ethnography of a gender-creative child growing up on the plantation island of Mauritius. Zomme Femme is also a fabular narrative that basks in queer cool magic. That is to say, La Mackerel's queer trans coming-of-age poetics desires for ancestry, for queer trans lineage within this, more precisely. As queer indenture studies scholar Alia Khan observes, quote, while questing for queers in the historical record, we may not find the ancestors we are looking for, end quote. And so La Mackerel imagines a trans femme ancestor named Kumkum, and I emphasize her fabular birth as a moment of conjure. Kumkum's greatest intervention is that she is pure imagination, an exuberant femme presence in a poem about inherited silences, La Mackerel recharts a femme genealogy and centers Kumkum as a fabular trans-femme point of origin. Zomme Femme, the title of the book, is in Mauritian Creole and refers to trans identity. It translates to trans femme specifically. And because the word lives in the anti-colonial language of Creole, the word Zomme Femme indexes decolonial gender formations. Invented in the 1700s in enslavement camps, today all Mauritians, regardless of race or ethnicity, speak Creole. Surfacing thus from Black displacement and exile, Creole is subsequently shared across communities, generating Black and brown seams in a place like Mauritius. As such, it's an example of linguistic colonial resistance that elicits an archive of endurance. If the title of La Mackerel's book is in Creole, Creole is also intentionally interspersed throughout the English text. And because La Mackerel does not offer any translation, Creole enacts as a severing presence. For those who understand, though, like me, a suturing transpires instead, and we're interpolated by the text through these flashes of Creole. As Creole severs and sutures across the text, I read the presence of Creole in Zomme Femme as a form of collage. La Mackerel's Creole selections are equally telling, choosing at times words that are difficult to translate. For example, the reader's first encounter with Creole after the title is the word muffin, and this is in the first poem about the author's birth story. Translating roughly to mean inauspiciousness, badly aligned stars, or evil eye, muffin is an especially Mauritian condition, grounded in superstition, and it is this sense of conjure that surrounds the author's first breath. Other careful selections in Creole include words like zil or l'océan, which mean island or ocean, but also z'histoire or kanjimun, which mean history or elders. Which is to say, as I argue that the poet fabulates a genealogy for the region, a trans queer femme one, my point is made most evident through the text's flashes of Creole, otherwise opaque to most. Returning to the notion of the ocean as archive, as both Hartman's Middle Passage and Bahadur's Kalapani, conjuring access to the past through fabulation, it is in fact Indian Ocean scholar Françoise Verger who first theorizes the oceanic as archival. I'll get to this image in a minute. So it's in fact Indian Ocean scholar Françoise Verger who first theorizes the oceanic as archival. More precisely, the Indian Ocean is an archive that is distinctly Creole, Creolization that, unlike Caribbean formations, occurs beyond the black and white binary. And this is because Asian-African exchanges in the region precede contact with European power. In this way, pre-colonial Creolization affects the shape of anti-colonial Creole in Mauritius today in multi-layered and sedimented ways. This Creolization, Verger insists, is singular and to what she terms the Indian Ocean paradigm. And my intention here is not to overly romanticize Creolization, risking a kind of vapid multiculturalism. However, I emphasize the process to, like Verger, preserve against the myths of ethnic purity, and in her words, the ethnicization of memory. If these anti-Black, or more specifically anti-Creole and casteist myths dominate the island, conceiving Creole as collage severs from this hegemonic Indo-nationalism while suturing across contemporary militancy of the younger diasporic generation, the island's Creole origins, and the Indian Ocean's longer history of Creolization. So to return to Bayjoo's collages here, once again, we see a backdrop of this vivid, dreamy blue-greens that augment the fabular texture of his work. So here in his Portal series, a pearl diver appears to be seated at the edge of the frame, and their head is lowered, their wrist is limp, suggesting a body fatigued by labor. The Plantation scene exposes how the overdeveloped world's dominant relationship to land and the land-water continuum has been one of extraction and exploitation. In a conversation with the artist, he shares what he learned through his archival encounters. That most of these laborers were indigenous children from Australia, kidnapped and brought over to Mauritius to conduct this enforced labor, given the agility of their smaller bodies. And there's still more to know of such lateral smuggling across the Indian Ocean. Bayjoo opts for alternative modes of witness, unbound by land-based modes of thinking and living, and plunged to the bottom of the ocean. This moment of rest reads as a radical refusal of capitalist demands for profit, decontextualized and repurposed. So in the original photograph, the figure is seated on a chair placed on a deck, which you might be able to see if you can imagine this figure sitting on a chair, but decontextualized and repurposed, Bayjoo transforms this colonial record of a laborer into an image of protest from below. Emphasizing stillness and cessation, Bayjoo's gestures are deceptively simple. So simple, it might be easy to mistakenly read his works as picturesque. However, Bayjoo deflates the stifling allure of the picturesque, especially in a place like Mauritius where the picturesque is, the pull towards the picturesque is so strong. Here, instead, he attends to the question of labor, required yet strategically invisibilized to maintain the picturesque. I also want to bring attention to Bayjoo's frames. And here I just wanted to show other examples other than the pearl diver, which, like his fabular collages, enact forms of archival descent through the aesthetic. They play with archival time by conjuring unsettled pasts, this time with the art historical canon itself. Referencing Rococo opulence alongside Romanticist Orientalism, Bayjoo cites ornate, lavish styles and the historical moments in which they exist to index the colonial violence endured during this time. And the intrusion of this outsider gaze does not merely involve fantastical projection, but signals material extraction as well. Not coincidentally, the decadence of the stretch of period known as the Rococo overlaps with the rise and height of the sugar plantation in the colonies. Rather than replicate this violence, though, Bayjoo undermines its legacy by intentionally making his frames out of plaster. And so, like pie crust, like sugar cake about to rot your teeth, that's Bayjoo, the crumbly materiality of Bayjoo's trompe-l'œil comes to the fore. Whereas visual strategies like vignettes and trompe-l'œil exert control by manipulating vision, Bayjoo appropriates these visual deceptions for their counter-visual promise. If art history has traditionally contained visuality, Bayjoo's dialogue with Mauritius registers other ways of seeing by centering the geographically remote. And so to conclude, I'd like to return to allegory. Bayjoo and Mackerel's approach to the Indian Ocean incite fabular archives motivated by the aesthetic. Between figures in En Famille, the first series, The Magician, the Pearl Diver here, and Kumkum, Bayjoo and Mackerel engender a fabular cast who are not just characters in a revised plot, but become purveyors of the structure of story itself, that is, fabular archival process. These allegories of archival method deliberately reroute from conventional evidentiary forms towards more imaginative forms of representation, bypassing veracity for something else that is ultimately more expansive. Bayjoo and Mackerel's aesthetic encounters with archival fragments augment the historical. This paradoxical abundance, and here I'm mobilizing Anjali Arondekar's archive studies, this paradoxical abundance refers not to what the archive can contain, but to what it cannot. The ungovernability of this yields untethered forms of knowing. Consider how the birth of photography is mired to knowledge production, surveillance, records of captivity, attention to the allegorical, more precisely turning the archival into allegories of archival method, counters overdetermined representations. However, Bayjoo and Mackerel's allegories not only set such archival logics adrift, but through the capaciousness of the aesthetic, conjure another kind of archival errancy altogether. Thank you.
Hello, and I want to thank everyone at the Africa Institute, Preeta, Laura, Jeremy, Salah, Satan, and everyone who worked behind the scenes and are continuing to work behind the scenes. So thank you. In this talk, I want to think about colorful threads and interwoven worlds of the Indian Ocean, two keywords of the symposium, to ask how can we center African histories, material cultures, and creative practices of the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean cultural worlds, objects in flux and people who carried them represent an array of history during their transits through different spaces, that is ports, markets, through oceans and lands, as they yoke new purposes and meanings for the intermediary bearer and the far end user. This talk expands the epistemological and spatial limits of the Indian Ocean by looking at two diverse cases that link African and Asian worlds through other processes, cartographies, and trajectories of exchanges. I look at how trade goods reveal lesser-known histories of African-Indian Ocean transactions by indexing connectedness shaped through pre-colonial, transcolonial, and contemporary networks and itinerants. First, I trace the arrival of African saints to Western India in pre-modern times and the subsequent histories that are entangled with pre-colonial empires and the Indian Ocean slave trade. Trade items and ritual objects associated with these saints connect India to terrains of exchange in Misr, Al-Habash, and Nubia regions, all important nodes of trans-Saharan trade networks that extend to West Africa. I then describe how contemporary artists like Bernard Okoye Jackson use textiles and other imported objects to perform intertwined histories of colonial commerce between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, and to generate public discussions of African goods with troubled pasts. These case studies are spatiotemporally distinct, spanning from pre-colonial to post-colonial times, and the objects and artworks explored are materially different, yet these examples chart the scope of inquiry that is necessary to unpack Africana spaces and the layered cultural and material histories that I gather around the productive concept of transit. Building on Jody Burke's seminal work on indigeneity and transit's transition as a result of imperialism, global capitalism, and settler colonialism, I employ the analytical framework of transit to move beyond migration and mobility studies to include literal and subjective crossings, iterative itineraries, and objects that are made to move in the Indian Ocean and beyond. In this talk, particularly, I use transit to examine different timelines and pathways of encounters to make sense of minority constituencies, intermediary actors, and spirited topographies as thresholds of African-Indian exchanges. More than migration, the concept of transit can inform us about non-linear and other forms of movements, real and reenacted, interrupted journeys, and stuckness, and other kinds of movers, non-humans, and objects. More than exchange, transit can help us look beyond commercial aspect of trade in the Indian Ocean towards sites of temporary anchorage, intercultural influences that are not temporally and spatially bound, and affinities born out of contingencies. More than diaspora, transit can provide a novel framework for an enhanced understanding of African descent communities in the Indian Ocean as African migration towards India spanned centuries and followed diverse and multi-directional routes. The history of circulation of everyday objects and luxury goods to East Africa and to the hinterlands have linked Africa and India for centuries through practices of consumption and aesthetic displays, as Jeremy Prestold, who is with us, and Pedro Machado has shown. Art historians Preeta Meyer, Alison Purpura, Janet Purdy, some of them here, and Mackenzie Moon have illustrated how circulation of aesthetic idioms from India to East Africa in particular is quite apparent in Swahili architecture, woodwork, furniture, and textile patterns. However, studies on the circulation of trade objects in the Indian Ocean have not really explored the complex ways in which they intersect with the forced movement of people in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, which have marked the social and cultural fabric of the African continent. While the Swahili coast and ports around the Horn of Africa were directly plugged into the Indian Ocean transregional trade, there were also transit geographies that connected the maritime sea lanes with overland routes. For instance, from the Red Sea ports, textile, beads, and spices that arrived from India were ferried into inland markets in North Africa, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and were carried further west along the Sahelian trade routes. Network of global trade routes extending across Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa connected the empires of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and Segu. This pre-colonial material and aesthetic transfers were explored through the monumental exhibition like Sahel Art and Empires on the Shore of the Sahara. Important geographies of transit in Misr, Egypt, Nubia, Egypt and Sudan, and Al-Habash, modern-day Ethiopia regions linked West Africa and Indian Ocean through complex trans-Saharan networks of traders, pilgrims, enslaved people, and through rhizomatic systems of commodity exchanges. Sub-Saharan cultures were connected to Nubia and Misr from very early times, and art historian Anissa Malwasin argues that early cultural relationship between Nile Valley civilizations and Iron Age West African cultures are visible through decorative representations on Nubian pottery from Meroitic periods. We see a historical circulation of several objects, creative knowledge, and decorative designs passing through Nubia and Misr and other Sahelian transits westward. Carnelian and other beads from Gujarat reached West Africa through trans-Saharan routes, and later commodities from India that were already in circulation in the Arab markets flowed along the Sahel after Mansa Musa's legendary travel to Mecca in the early 14th century, which had a paramount impact on the influx of Islam and trade goods to Mali and other neighboring regions. Some of the Sahelian transit routes with connection to Western India are illustrated through the life histories and spiritual journeys of African saints in India. Oral histories of African mystics, Baba Gaur, Baba Habash, Mai Misra, directly connect them to oceanic circulation of beads and textiles from India that were used to purchase enslaved persons from Africa. Nubia's connection to Cambay in the pre-modern era is recounted through oral hagiographies of Baba Gaur, who is the patron saint of the African descent community in India. According to CD African Indian oral histories, Baba Gaur's real name was Sidi Mubarak Nobi, and he hailed from Nubia, which currently encompasses South Egypt and Central Sudan. In some instances, Baba Gaur and his followers or kins are noted to have migrated from Kano in Nigeria to India, following the Sahelian routes to Abyssinia and then traveling westwards. Various sources credit Baba Gaur for modernizing the agate mining in Ratanpur, literally translated as place of gems. Oral hagiographies also recount Baba Gaur's knowledge of drilling and carving carnelian beads and sing the saint's contribution to the lapidary as he shared the knowledge of cooking the agate beads in high temperature that enhanced their luster and aesthetic value of the beads. The banded agate, called as Baba Gauria, is a synecdochal reference for the African holy man himself. Africa and India are fused together into the banded agate as knowledge of shared technologies shaped the finished beads that were used in Islamic prayers. Carnelian beads from Cambay, found in recently excavated sites of Gao and Timbuktu in Mali, provide more information on the carnelian export from Gujarat to West Africa in pre-modern times. Because of Baba Gaur's contribution to the bead industry, he was deeply respected and venerated upon his death by the Islamic bead makers of Gujarat, and his grave is located close to the agate mines. Baba Gaur's resting place later became the center of worship for the African descent community in India. Like Baba Gaur, his sister Mai Mishra is a patron saint of the African descent community and is associated with the calligraphic agate bead. Mai Mishra, who hailed from Misr or Egypt, traveled to India and used a tie-dye shawl as the sail of a dhow to cross the Indian Ocean. The saint's real name is unknown, and she has been respectfully addressed as Mother, prefixed with the term Misra. Thus, her name metonymically suggests her relationship to Misr. The saint is often symbolically represented by the Siddhis through tie-dyed textiles. Gujarat has a long history of textile production, and for over a millennium, craftsmen have mastered exquisite dresses dye technique. Mai Mishra's association with textile and tie-dye is perhaps a symbolic reference by the Siddhis to the forced migration of African women, textile trade, and the kind of labor they performed in India, that is domestic labor, craft production, mining, and dyeing. Fragmentary accounts indicate that enslaved African women often worked in the textile and dyeing industries of Gujarat. Siddhi women in Jamnagar and Surat, both still textile centers of India, continue to work in the informal sector using tie-dye or madani, which requires precision skills of tying and making small knots to create an elaborate pattern. Techniques of tie-dye and resist dyeing were knowledges exchanged along the Indian Ocean and the Sahel, with each culture along the trade route sharing, adapting, and reinventing styles of dyeing and design. The tomb of Mai Mishra is covered in multiple tie-dye textiles that are often given by devotees. And at the home altar of the Siddhi community, the fragment tie-dye textiles then become a screen, a marker for the presence of the saint itself. Mai Mishra is also associated with a musical instrument. The Mai Mishra musical instrument is made of dried coconut shells into which small agate beads are filled and then attached with a wooden stick handle. These coconut rattles are then wrapped in fragments of red tie-dye textiles, which are used in Siddhi ritual performances. The travel narratives of these black saints, I'm skipping a slide. The travel narratives of these black saints symbolize the main overland and maritime routes through which enslaved Africans were forcefully transported to the Indian subcontinent. The intertwined history of objects of sub-Saharan trade with black saints suggests a rhizomatic connection and while attaining new meanings and valences through their many transfers. With the arrival of the Portuguese and Dutch in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, pre-colonial routes of transcontinental commerce became realigned as European vessels began carrying textiles and beads from Gujarat and spices from the Malabar coast to the Guinea coast. European vessels traveling to ports in the Gulf of Guinea and Gold Coast capitalized on the West African demand of international goods and carried tons of beads and textiles where they were exchanged for gold and later for captured Africans. A range of beads, including jasper, agate cups, and vases from Cambay and textiles from Cambay, flowed into the West African markets through these sea lanes. As the transatlantic slave trade gained momentum, European trading companies used Indian cotton and silk to purchase enslaved persons in West African coast. Ghanaian artist Bernard Okoye Jackson uses trade objects to interrogate these colonial transactions in Ghana and the post-colonial legacies of empire of trade. Okoye Jackson combines diverse genres like masquerade, installation, photography, and walking to produce works that are absurd, yet critical of hybrid post-colonial African identities. In this talk, I will profile 3 works of Okoye Jackson created for the exhibition Time, Trade, and Travel. In the 3 photographs, he constructs 3 chromatically distinct characters: Goldman, Dutchman, and Greyman. Styled in striking costumes, Okoye Jackson posed for the camera inside Usher Fort. The Dutch constructed the fort in 1649 chiefly for facilitating transoceanic commerce, but during the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, it became a site where enslaved Africans were imprisoned under inhumane conditions. The fort was transferred to the British in 1868 and was converted into a prison that remained in operation till 1993. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, was imprisoned there during the independence movement. The fort thus has direct connections to Ghana's colonial and post-colonial histories. Okoye Jackson's characters attempt to make visually intelligible Gold Coast's ignored commodity consumptions and its entanglements with empires of trade, particularly the Dutch. In this photograph, Dutchman, Okoye Jackson is seen wearing a European Regency tailored jacket and pants made out of Dutch wax print. The Dutchman is seen holding a Bible and a wooden gun studded with cowries polished in gold paint, which are made out of brass and commissioned by the artist from a metal worker in Kumasi. Through objects like gold-polished brass cowries, Okoye Jackson references older histories of craft and commerce, such as gold trade and African metal crafts that were used as currencies in Africa before cowries from Indian Ocean arrived in West Africa. He also hints to ways in which Dutch and other European officials who profited from the trade would often use international objects as props when they commissioned their portraits during their tenure at Gold Coast. Okoye Jackson critiques such visual documentation of colonial power through his Dutch image in which he poses on the stairs of Usher Fort wearing a white eye mask and a wig. The Gold Man refers to Gold Coast's extensive trade in gold during post-colonial and colonial time. The artist holds objects like Dutch snaps, a mirror studded with cowries, and layered textiles wrapped around his waist to visibilize objects that were traded for enslaved people. Referencing multiple Ghanaian traditions instead of one particular culture at a particular point of time in history, Okoye Jackson carries an imitation Akan sword in one hand. The image titled Grey Man is a play on the shades of gray, as this character represents the murky history of colonial exchanges and oceanic cultural crossovers. Okoye Jackson wears a shirt made out of red tie-dye textile, which in the 18th century was a lucrative trade item from India to the Bight of Benin and the Guinea coast. Although Okoye Jackson did not know this entangled history at that point of time, he chose the textiles to suggest the influx of cheap Indian and Chinese textiles into the Ghanaian markets, because the textile is also used by Krobo women in the coming-of-age ceremony, which is Dippo. The red tie-dye cloth thus plays on purity and impurity and transitions. Other objects in the picture were collected by the artist during his travel to Netherlands as part of the research for the exhibition project. After the exhibition, Akoy Jackson's characters began walking in historical streets of Africa, India, United States, and Europe. Collecting an object from place he had walked, Akoy Jackson inserts the item in his next performance with other adornments, textiles, and props. As within the Indian Ocean and Atlantic commerce transactions, objects that the artist collected from one place transited through many spaces, thus assigning new value and meanings. In 2012, I invited him to participate in the exhibition Interstices at Cochin. In this piece, Akoy Jackson started his walk at Kochi's Dutch Palace and slowly paced through the spice market in Matancheri, which had been the hub of spice trade for centuries. In 2015, Akoy Jackson performed a similar performative walk in New Delhi as part of the Koch International Artists Association's project, Currents Across India and Africa. Walking through Kirki Extension in New Delhi, a locality that houses several African students, Akoy Jackson, through his walk, aimed to transit through post-colonial African migrant spaces to spur a conversation about post-colonial racialization of Africans in India. The global history of empires traced through commodities is manifested through the layered adornments that Akoy Jackson carries with him through his walks and his interactions with the audience post-performance. He encourages the local public to reflect upon their histories, as well as how historical documentation selects and deselects narratives worthy of representation. An approach to Indian Ocean and Atlantic connections through people and objects in transit offers new perspectives on Afro-Asian cultures, memories, terrains, and epistemologies, and lend a different understanding to histories of circulation, mobility, and reciprocal impact of racial and ethnic imaginaries. I have stressed that these Black oceanic geographies, that is of the Indian Ocean and Atlantic, are connected not just historically, but across multiple realms: material, performative, visual, ritualistic, and symbolic. To conclude, as African and Indian worlds were and are accessed through objects, arts, and non-human media, they continue to visually index unwritten histories of the African Indian Ocean worlds, even as they got revised, redesigned, and reimagined. Thank you. Did you leave something?
Let me start by just thanking all of you for these very rich and very different, although still interconnected papers. In some way, I feel that our discussions from yesterday and what came up a bit this morning about archival silences and interiorities that focus particularly on research method can be kind of seen as reemerging here or being carried forward with all of these papers to think and talk about artistic craft. And I'm thinking here of what Natasha points to with relation to Bayjoo and Mackerel's work as allegories of archival method. It seems to me that all of these papers are describing artistic practices, interventions of fabulation, of conjuring, creating out of absence, fragment, loss, and maybe repression. So as a way of jump-starting this conversation, and rather than attempting to summarize what all of you have very beautifully already presented to the room. I want to sort of experimentally attempt to weave, also to work with the title of this conference, some threads between your disparate projects by pulling out some of the analytical vocabulary offered by each of these papers, and then invite each of you to apply or to respond to one another's analytics in order to think with them about your own projects. So I'll sort of address each of you with an idea that I'm taking from one of the other papers. So these are not in the order that you presented, but yeah. So for Natasha, I'm struck by the resonance between what you describe as Le Mackerel's conjuring of the queer ancestor and Pamila's suggestion that the symbol of the dodo comes to stand in some popular imaginary for a feelingly missed indigenous ancestor. So I'm wondering if you could comment on whether and how Pamila's use of the feelingly missed and the stories about the loss of stories offer any kind of deepening of an affective dimension to the political work that you're seeing these pieces do in the Mauritian diaspora. I'm thinking also of the image that you had up for us at the end of the laborer at rest, which you describe as an image of protest, that the rest in some way is protest, but that it seems to me you could also think of or interpret as a posture of mourning or of loss. So sort of thinking with that affective dimension. For Gaurav, I'm wondering what Natasha's meditations on juxtaposition, on disruption, on, if not anti-narrativity, I don't think works here when we're talking about a novel, but at least a rejection of a master narrative or of narrative seamlessness offers for thinking about particularly the relation of Gurna's form to the themes of intimacy and desertion that he's occupied with in this novel. So, it seems to me that novel is characterized by this central rupture between the two generations, right? That he moves from the narrative of Pierce and Rehana to the one about Rashid, Farida. And I mean, he doesn't really come back to that earlier narrative at all, right? So it's a kind of desertion that he performs, right, of that initial narrative. I'm just curious how you read those disjunctures, disruptions at the level of form in relation to this thematizing that you're pulling out of illicit intimacies, taboo, interracial, illicit intimacies. For Pamila, does Nilima's idea of transit complicate the framework for understanding the dodo? How are the flightlessness of the dodo and its association with fabulated, maybe, indigeneity, or we might use here the ecological term of endemicity, right? That its association with islandness, which is also what makes it vulnerable to extinction, right? How does this, complicated by the circulation of its body parts and bones, as you describe, but also of the icon itself, right? Its dispersion into British children's stories, into your own bathroom, right? And maybe asked another way, does the storytelling about the dodo depend on transit, even as it claims this kind of rootedness? And then finally, for Nilima, does Gaurav's idea of fraught intimacies offer anything to an understanding of Akoy Jackson's focus on the body, and particularly the racialized body, in the form of these adornments, the physical movement through space, bodily proximities, in this representation of Afro-Indian entanglement? And I want to sneak in one extra question for you. Might we think of, I found myself wondering at the end about the relationship between Natasha's notion of the narrative seam and sort of between the Indian Ocean and the Black Atlantic, or between the brown and black populations, right? To think about what seems to me a tethering that you're doing of the material and the representative, to come back to Preeta's sort of generative tension that she opened our conference with. So those are my questions.
All right, thank you. That was a really nice exercise in thinking interrelationality through the papers. Yeah, this is great. I think this idea of transit is really important because you have to go elsewhere to find the origins of the story, and it's exactly that. And it struck me while I was doing this work, because my PhD was on the body parts of a saint, and I was like, oh, I haven't gone that far, actually. I moved over to body parts of a bird, you know? What does that tell you in 20 years, right? So I feel like the story of the dodo is all about the sort of, like you exactly said, the conjuring out of the loss. And that conjuring, and I really wanted to use rumor as sort of my methodology to access what's the possibilities of thinking about the dodo. And I had to, and I think the presentation reflected this, I had to sort of wade through so much material to access what the story of the dodo is. Like, I didn't know anything about the dodo bird until I started this. And it was just this naive idea of, oh, the extinct dodo bird, right? And to sort of map that out, I had to go through and tell a story of transit in order to access it. And you can't do it without that concept of transit. So that's a really nice way, I think, of framing that story, to sort of come back to Mauritius in the end, because you have to go elsewhere in order to return. Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like that circulation tells you the story and how it then comes back. And the fact that I was struck by, I've been to Mauritius several times, and I went there first in 2005, and then to go there now and to see that proliferation of the dodo bird really struck me in a way that it hadn't before, and what it means in this particular moment. I think it's very different than what it used to mean, So I wanted to play around with that. Thanks for that.
Sure, yeah, sure. No, thank you for that. You asked some very difficult questions here, but thank you. So no, on the rejection of the master narrative, there is, on the one hand, there is this rejection, and especially not so much the master narrative, but judgment, right? I mean, that's the crux of the novel. I think every time we want to make a judgment, Gurna wants to make us take a couple of steps back, and on what basis are we making this judgment? Even judgments that seem to us to be so clear cut, like the departure of colonialism. Even that he wants to question. So that's really interesting. How does he do it in terms of form? I mean, there are multiple ways in which form enters the picture. I think the most obvious way for me, and the most immediate one to talk about, is the point of view of the narrator, which for the most part is Rashid, but the chapter goes, when there's a chapter which is spoken, presented from Amin's point of view, that makes a big difference. And also, just again, not just the unsurety of judgment in terms of whatever we might judge each of these relationships to be, whether it's a relationship of sexual exploitation, or whether it's a relationship of genuine love and romance, or whether it's somewhere in between, or whether it might shift back and forth. On the level of form, the novel does that in terms of even the surety or unsurety of its narration, especially revolving the case of how did they fall in love? What could have been possibilities? And like 5-6 different scenarios that he points out. This might be a possibility, that might have been a possibility. We'll never know. That kind of stuff. So I think there is. You're right. I mean, there is both at the level of like the thematics and the message that he's trying to convey, and it's an angry message, right? In many ways. Somebody was asking me the other day, have you ever seen Gurna happy? Because most of his novels are very sad and very depressing. But there is a little level of anger there as well. But it is. In the aesthetic form of it, he makes it so beautiful. I mean, that passage that I read out about the mendacities of racial identities and how they've been. I mean, it's just every time I read that passage, I'm kind of shaken by it. There's the beauty of the prose itself is what I would say.
Thank you for this wonderful set of questions. I'd like to probably start with the body itself. So what is interesting with the African saints in India is that they have been extensively studied in terms of diaspora or in terms of histories of migration, but not as, they were not probably connected with materials that they represent, because today their body is simply understood through these materialities. Nobody knew how the saint looked. They really do not know his name, but they just know that he was a bead maker, and he's known, one of his name is through the very name of the bead himself, which is black and white bands. So the black saint with in white robes. So likewise for the female saint of the African diasporic community, nobody again knows how she looked or her name, but her embodiment is extended through the materiality of the tie-dye textile. So she is known, represented through the tie-dye textile and the processes of dyeing and patterning. So there is a certain kind of materiality attached to the embodiment itself, which I found interesting because Bernard Okoye Jackson kind of picks up on that and uses the same thing, kind of wrapping his body with all these materialities or trade commodities to show how the black body, or how the histories of the black bodies changed with the arrival of trade commodities to the Gold Coast. And speaking of Indian Ocean, I am someone who entered the Indian Ocean through the Atlantic. Interestingly, my family hails from two Indian Ocean port cities of Calicut and Cochin, but never, it's boring to study the place that you're born. So you wanted to be cool and studying something else. So I actually entered the Indian Ocean through the Atlantic. And having said that, while the Atlantic framework is very generative to understand Indian Ocean and to theorize Indian Ocean, we have to be very cautious to not flatten both the spaces, because the African diasporic experiences of the Atlantic and the histories are very different from the Indian Ocean. So if we are using Black Atlantic as a framework of comparison with the Indian Ocean, we need to be cautious about that.
Thanks, Meg, for this exercise. So thinking about the Dodos as a stand-in for indigeneity in a place like Mauritius, this is something that Shiraz Bayjoo has thought of as well. And so, because there are works of his that work through archival images of the Dodo. And we were talking about this, Pamela, debris lithographs. And the way that he's, and this, it's sort of related to even just the ethics of the kind of archival disclosures that he's also, there's that question of like, what do we do with these people that we encounter in the archives, right? And I really appreciated the way that he sort of thinks about his work as, one becomes custodians of these images, and so it becomes a kind of practice of care. And I think that in the absence of human indigeneity, at least on the island, there's quite a bit of floral and fauna indigeneity. But in the absence of human indigeneity, then what happens is there's a kind of care for the island that becomes that stand-in. And I think that we could think of this care as part of the research that we do. And as far as the island itself, I'm thinking specifically the people came together for the oil spill in 2020. Thinking of course, this care within the context of the dodo bird is, in a way, kind of, late in it, given its extinction. And so there's this kind of, yeah, so I would say that it's a useful exercise for me to think of, I mean, I obviously it's just quite random, but it makes sense because Bayjoo is thinking specifically about the dodo bird in that way. And it is a way to think about his archival process as well, the ethics of his archival process as well, through a kind of, as a custodian.
I think we should open it up to the room for any other questions or comments about the papers.
Oh, sorry, it's working now. Muhammad Ali, I'm a researcher here. I'm an archaeologist and a researcher from Sudan. And my question, it sounds like, it's directly to you. Yeah, it's a comment, it's not a question. It's about your paper that talking about the exchange system and so on. And in fact, the exchange system, especially the long-distance trade between Nubia and the other market, it's one of the models that we have it from presented by some research in order to address the state itself and its connection with other places within Africa. And you mentioned something about the export probably and the exchange system between India and Nubia, and specifically and the influence of the art on Nubia too. So in fact, so far from archaeological records, we don't have that much evidence that support that argument, that direct connection with Nubia. And you mentioned something also about the carnelian and agate probably and something like that, but from the archaeological record we have too. And recently, we have been thinking about where did they get that from. We know the raw material available in Nubia there, but we are thinking about how did they make it and so forth. But recently, like a few years ago, they found really beads workshops in Nubia, and it's going back even earlier than the Nubian civilization, Meroitic and Nabatean period in Sudan. And therefore, I would think that probably they were made locally, especially that we found it in different parts of Sudan, and that could be related to the microeconomy exchange system in Sudan too. So I doubted that it was imported from somewhere else, of course, the carnelian, and it's different type of carnelians, of course, and agate beads. The second part is about the art influence from probably by Indians and so on. I think that's Randy Holland was the first one who mentioned that, and she was trying to find that connection between India and Sudan, and that's specifically about the god Abadamak. And we have, in fact, only one representation for that god, Badamak, in Badamak Temple, which is the lion god, we call it. And that representation shows only 3 faces. It shows 3 faces for the first time in the Nubian art. And for that reason, she tried to connect, that 3-headed god, especially that you have it in India with Sudan. She's trying to find that kind of connections. But in fact, there was many critique about that, especially that was the first time that we have the king and queen that represented on temple pylons in Sudan. And therefore, the king usually, and the king and the god usually face each other for blessing and so forth. But in this case, we have the queen and the god and the king at the same time, together with the god. That's why it was facing the queen and the god. And that's why they didn't take it as an evidence for the connection between India and probably Sudan. Thank you. It's just a comment. It'd be good if you could go back. I would love also to see the article you mentioned. I missed the citation you mentioned in your paper there. You mentioned, I'd be happy to have it and see it later. And there's another question, just very for the Dodo, the bird. Yeah, the bird. Do we have any archaeological record for that from any archaeological context for the Dodo there? Dodo or Dodo? Yeah, it'd be good to know something about that at least. And I'm asking that question just to think, because as an archaeologist, I will think about the connection between the animals and humans in terms of ritual. Sometimes we find it depends on the archaeological context too. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. And I should probably talk to you after the conference. But in terms of carnelian, yes, you're right. There was carnelians and other kind of agate beads in sub-Saharan Africa too, mined along the Sahel. So what I'm talking about is very small amount of carnelian that has probably flowed along the Sahel, right? And I am particularly interested in this very minor circulation because of the very name of the saint, and also how that minor circulation is connecting West Africa with Western Indian Ocean. So I don't think the export, of course, was that big of a trade. Probably only a handful of, or slightly more, had come. And there was actually a recent chemical testing done on carnelian beans by Tim and Saul, and I think some of you would know about it, and others. So they actually were able to identify it back to Cambay. So, but I would love to have a conversation with you after this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a lot of archaeological evidence in the digging of the bones. I skipped that section in the paper, but there's sort of 4 names of 19th century, British, French, one was a school teacher, sort of happenstance, because I always wondered if it went extinct, where were all the bones of these dead dodo birds? And what happened is because they got sedimented in the mud in a particular area because of the river currents around the island. And so they discovered that this was a depository, so they found thousands and thousands of bones. And so there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence that perhaps that they either got stuck there and then drowned in a series of successive events, or that the bones got moved at some point there. So there's a larger study on the archaeology of the dodo bones themselves, because it was a mystery for quite a long time as to if they did die, where did they, why are we not finding these remains? And again, this is all speculation because, it went extinct in 1683, so it's hard to sort of fabulate, to use that word, that history and what perhaps happened. So there was these moments of ebbs and flows where the dodo was not of interest, and then it would be again because you would discover something new about it. Huh? So that would create part of the story. Can I ask a question, if that's okay? Yeah? No, to Gaurav. I'm just wondering, because I had the fortune of being in a residency with Abdul Razak Gurna in 2018 at STIAS, which is the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, and we were sort of paired together. And, his whole sort of how much is he Zanzibari himself is always an issue. And, it struck me at the time that, he said, I left when I was 18, I went into exile, I went to the UK, and I consider myself British. And, it's just thinking about sort of his, Nobel Prize and what's happening to his Zanzibariness as a way of reading his works and his own biography of that. And then Francisca and I were having a conversation about her painter, Hamid, right? Her paintings now being used to illustrate his books. And the fact that you were saying that the books themselves don't really pertain to what the topics of his novels are, but this idea that you have to put these two Zanzibaris together, text and image, to set this up, this relationality of Zanzibariness and sort of the selling of that identity politics. And I think it's a conversation we're having early about the prescription of identities onto artists in ways that, perhaps they're not comfortable with authors as well, If you could respond to that.
Yeah, I don't know much about what I can respond to the image and text situation, because I don't know the specific context itself. But I have spoken with many authors, and they do protest too much. I don't believe a word when he says that, he doesn't think of himself as a Zanzibari. I mean, he's obsessed with Zanzibar, right? Yes, he may be a British national, and yes, I'm sure that, in many ways, people form, identity is always multiple, and, depending on what what context he's in. He might not want to be pigeonholed as a, as a Zanzibari in some context, and not wanting to be pigeonholed as a, British, subject or British citizen on the other. But I mean, there is no way that you can read any of his work. And I mean, he's obsessed. Thank you. I mean, he's obsessed with Zanzibar. I mean, you can take Gurna out of Zanzibar, but you can't take Zanzibar out of Gurna, I don't think.
Sorry, I would just add to that I was recently in Zanzibar with Abdul Razak Gurna for the Zanzibar Book Fair just like a few weeks ago, and he addressed the crowd in Kiswahili and, was to be sitting at rooftop bars, and he's pointing out so-and-so used to live there, and so-and-so, I mean, he's very much rooted in that space. I mean, yes, it's a nostalgic also, but yeah, I think he's Zanzibari. Yeah. I've been told that we're out of time. Is that correct? Who has the time? Sorry, I don't have a clock on me. So can we take two more? And I'll
Just ask the questions and we can respond later.
Okay, yeah. So let's hear Francisca, and then here, I'm sorry, I forget your name.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you, but I also would love to add to, Pamila, what you brought up and ask you, Gaurav, because I really don't think it's very productive at the moment to keep attributing this identity of being Zanzibari specifically to Abdul Razak Gurna. I think it is much more about what we've been speaking about at this conference so much, the emotions, the affect, all of these senses of desertion, of unbelonging, of belonging, etc., that really go far beyond this attribution of nationality that, of course, he very strongly seems to identify with, so does Lubaina Hamid, but it is not precisely this fitting into a box of being a Zanzibari, if you will, that seems to matter here. So I'm wondering, or what I'm a bit concerned about, is this conflation that I observe with, for example, Gurna, with his works. Because does he really write about himself, or to have this effective spectrum be taken back or applied back to him or whoever he associates with, or does he give us these prompts to think about them in a very different context? So I would just like to stir that into the conversation. Thank you.
Tash, thanks very much for beautiful paper. I wondered about, I feel very contrarian at this conference, asking of people to do things that they said they wouldn't want to do. But if you were to do an intermediate reading between the two artists that you are working on, what are the queer possibilities of that? What are the queer possibilities of doing an intermediate reading across the works of the two artists that you are writing about?
Oh, and can I just add one quick question? And no, but Nidhi has a question too. So this is just a big, because it's come up so much yesterday, today, and definitely through the day-to-day. It's about method, and it's about the terms we use to describe our method. And it's what is the gap between interpretation and fabulation, right? Because what is the work that the scholar does, that the historian does, that the artist does? And there is a huge, for me, a big spectrum of work that we do between, like art historians do formal analysis, we're interpreting works. I wouldn't call that fabulation. We also do selection of sources, and we put those sources next to each other as collage. That is also not fabulation, but then there is fabulation. So I'm just interested in us thinking across that range of things. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really productive panel. I have many questions, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to sort of limit it. One is specifically for Gaurav around, desertion, which is I mean, I love that novel, so thank you for, bringing it here. And one of the questions was around sort of, I mean, in that novel, he's taking this like older trope or, this continual trope around women on shore, men at sea, right? And the kind of, I mean, that's the novel, it's a desertion, but also using it as a kind of, I mean, I'm not quite sure how to read it because there's so many different sort of moments in which this happens, right? And also using it as a kind of way to trace sort of different connections across, right? East Africa to South Asia, and then also to the colonial sort of, to the metropole. So how does one sort of take this older trope of, women on shore, men at sea, and actually kind of, I mean, how much of it is sort of speaking to that in your mind? I've been trying to figure this out with that novel, actually, so just interested to hear you on it. And for Neelima, thinking about the Bandhani as a kind of stand-in for Mai Mishra, I mean, the Bandhani is used in women's shrines across Gujarat, right? So what is specific about the type of Bandhani used to commemorate Mai Mishra, and what is at stake at kind of reading Mai Mishra as an African saint, right? Because again, points of origin and so on are so contested in the legend of Mai Mishra, and many of the saints in Gujarat come from elsewhere, right? So how does one kind of read that? Just curious to kind of hear. Yeah.
Since we have to be at our next location in 20 minutes, can you take like 1 minute for each response?
Thank you. Yeah. No, thank you. We'll continue over dinner for sure. And I'll just say really quickly, I mean, part of what, okay, so yes, I think that there's definitely a distinction to be made, and there's a wide spectrum across interpretation and fabulation. I think of fabulation as this kind of vista that then will, as an opening. And so, that which cannot be verified in the archive, fabulation offers us a kind of, opening to this conundrum. And that's different than, if I'm interpreting the work, there's a lot that we could sort of read into an image, and a lot that, of that can't necessarily be verified. And I think that's, I just think of fabulation as an opening, much like it's been theorized already. And, that actually allows for more interpretation, really. But, when I'm interpreting the work, I would like for that, a lot of interpretation is, evidenced as well, right? So, what can we do, within the limits and outside the limits of evidence? And as far as, thinking queerly, I wanted, I thought very carefully, and I was, in terms of putting these two artists together, like what's the gesture here? And for me, it's really about thinking about how one, so yes, they're both hailing from the Mauritian diaspora, and yes, they're working through fabulation, but, honestly, the comparison sort of ends there. And I still wanted to write a paper about the two, because I do think that ultimately I'd like to think of the aesthetic as a queer archival logics. And I think that I can do that with I think Shiraz's work allows me to think through queer theory, even though I'm not thinking about queer identity in his work.
I'll try to answer Nidhi's question. You're very right, and I'm not contesting that tie-dye textiles is associated with saints who have come from elsewhere, and you can find them throughout Gujarat. I'm not contesting any of that. And so what I've been trying to probably highlight is that we do not know the identities of these saints, but they have been indexed through these trade commodities, because time and again, in their shrines, in other kind of symbolic representations, musical instrument used, but also rituals associated with these saints, these trade commodities then become a stand-in representation, so, which is super interesting for me. So that's what I was trying to highlight.
In the interest of time, I'll leave.
Yeah, so very quickly, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think it's an error to equate author's biography with, what they're trying to do. I mean, what he does is exceeds so much of more than what his own life was. I also think, on the other hand, it's not appropriate to cordon it off. I mean, I would argue that even the most scholarly work that we do is autobiographical in some ways. So I think, I think it's a continuum more than anything else. So that's what I would say. And in terms of the question that you raised about men say, on the sea and women at home, that's very much the case in Desertion. And I think, and I'm going to say two things about it. One could make an argument that, it's, think about the particular historical context, but that's not true, because there were women, traveling on the seas as well. And if you look at other novels based in the same time period, like Vasanji's, for instance, even the Gunny Sack, you have women travelers, who are coming from South Asia, for instance, to Zanzibar, to East Africa. And so that is a kind of limitation of that particular novel. Of course, you look at some of his later novels that are set, let's say, in the UK, like The Gift, you've got women, of a future generation, right, who are now already in the metropole, coming from those areas of Zanzibar and East Africa. So, but the point you make is an important and true one. In this particular novel, it is very much of that kind of binary. So, yeah, thank you.